Greetings, friends, and welcome back to the podcast of Jewish Ideas, a Torah in Motion production. I'm JJ Kimchi. The Haskalah is usually translated as the Jewish Enlightenment and described as a Jewish version of the broader European Enlightenment, which stressed a rational, scientific understanding of the world, political liberalism, and a turn towards secularization within the public sphere. The epicenter of the Haskalah, we are often told, was Berlin during the late 18th century and centered around the figure of Moses Mendelssohn and his Germanic disciples. Recent scholarship, however, has greatly complicated this picture, drawing our attention to an equally, or perhaps more important facet of the Haskalah, that of the 19th century. This Haskalah took place under very different political, geographical, sociological, and religious circumstances. It is this latter form of Haskalah, both part of and yet quite different from the 18th century, which we shall be investigating today. One of the major scholars who's been arguing for this shift is our guest today, Dr. Olga Litvak, who is the Eric and Laurie Roth Professor of Modern European Jewish History at Cornell University. Professor Litvak has published widely on the history and culture of Eastern European Jewry, and her pivotal work, Haskalah, the Romantic Movement in Judaism, was published by Rutgers University in 2012. It is a pleasure to welcome her to the podcast of Jewish Ideas today. Professor Litvak, welcome.
Thank you so much, JJ. It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. So let's dive in. This is a fascinating topic, and fascinating for me personally. It's something of my personal area of interest. So the essential thesis of your book, Haskalah, the Romantic Movement, challenges a, let's say, commonly accepted or commonly written about notion of the Haskalah as the Jewish Enlightenment. So could you first explain what the common conception is, why people think like this, why people define the Haskalah in this way, and then what are your reasons for believing this perception to be incorrect?
Well, almost since the moment when people began to investigate the passage towards modernity in Jewish history, they have worked against the background of an argument where it's the Enlightenment that initiates the modern moment in the Jewish past, right? And this movement towards modernity has been associated with the kind of adoption or the entry of Enlightenment principles, both political, metaphysical, scientific. There is this attachment to an idea that Jewish modernity operates under the rubric of enlightenment, under its critical rubric, under its political rubric. So that means that on the one hand, it's moved by the same kind of Voltairean idea of a chasel, une femme, right? The critique of religion on the one hand, but also driven by the political desire for Jewish emancipation and for the liberation of the Jewish individual from the dead hand of the Jewish past. People are attached to this idea, I think, largely because it's such a powerful kind of, people are attached to the moment of crisis, right? That there is this radical shift and that, it fits into this paradigm where on the one hand you have traditional Judaism and then you'll have modernity, which comes crashing against tradition under the auspices of enlightenment. And this goes back a very long way, and it's a paradigm that unites, both Marxist historians of the Jewish experience with Zionist historians. They're all equally attached to it, and it has the status of it's the one aspect of Jewish history writing that goes almost without debate. And the problem with this, when I was asked to write this book. It was supposed to be for the general reader, a kind of introduction to the term Haskalah. And I started to I've always been suspicious because I'm an Eastern Europeanist, and the discrepancy between the adherents of the Haskalah, most of which I knew from the study of Eastern European Jewish history, and the insistence at the same time that it was German, didn't make sense to me. And once I started looking into what kind of work they actually produced and where they lived and how they operated, it became clear to me that there was a profound gap between the insistence that what we're dealing with here is some kind of initiation into Western European Jewish history, some kind of moment of crisis that brought up traditional Eastern European Jews against its confrontation with the West. It didn't make sense because that is not where most of my people didn't live in the West. Berlin, where the Haskalah was supposed to have started, was not part of Western Europe in the 18th century. And the kinds of books that these people wrote didn't fit into the standard library of Enlightenment texts. Generically, it didn't make any sense. There was no Jewish Voltaire. There was no Jewish Hume. There was no Jewish Locke. They were writing about things that were completely different. And there was a kind of lack of fit. So that's really, I started empirically. I was trying to give an overview to the general reader, and I realized that I couldn't really write it because every time I tried to summarize the scholarship, I would hit my head against the wall because the material that I was actually supposed to discuss didn't fit any of the, it was like sticking square pegs into round holes. So I started to look, a little bit more, and I was trying to figure out how to position this movement against the background of the lives and experiences of the actual people who made it. I looked at what other people, these other Eastern Europeans were doing in the early part of the 19th century. I looked at Berlin and its cultural context, and it became clear that the connections between contemporary Eastern European writers and their Jewish counterparts were much closer. I began to track a kind of ambivalence towards enlightenment that people had noticed before, but insisted that this was just itself was part of enlightenment. People had written about this, but nobody had conceptualized what it all meant, right? And no one had questioned that this evidence pointed to somewhere else, right? In many ways, I feel like, the kind of work that I was doing was a kind of synthesis. I think the scholarship was ultimately headed this way anyway, just took somebody to kind of put it all together. I did, of course, primary source work, but really the inspiration for this were the discrepancies within the scholarship itself. No one seemed to know what to do with the contradictions that people were finding in the texts and how to think about them. So that's how I ended up here.
So, firstly, can I just say, on behalf of all of those who work in this area, I'd like to thank you for writing your book, because this very much tracks with my experience as an undergraduate studying these things, where you read some of the great books that have been written on the Jewish Enlightenment. There's some excellent scholarship by people like Shmuel Feiner and David Sorkin and others, but they seem to write about the Jewish Enlightenment as though it was entirely taking place in the 1770s, 1780s, entirely in Germany, more or less, and that's it. But of course, you're reading the primary text, you're like, hang on, almost all of this stuff is taking place 1820s, 1830s, 40s, 50s, in Warsaw, in Vienna, in Russia. There's an enormous amount going on, very much not where the Haskalah was supposed to have taken place. So firstly, on behalf of all of us, thank you for readjusting this. But now that you have, so now I have to ask you, you've taken this concept Haskalah, which we all thought we knew what it meant, but now you're saying we have to rethink it. So in which case, let me ask you, how would you then define the Haskalah under your reconception of it? What were its central features, let's say, its central concerns? Where and when did it take place, more or less? How should we look at this phenomenon now?
One way to think about this, Romanticism is a kind of shorthand for this shift. But, I've written about it in contexts where I try not to even use this word because it gets us into another normative kind of morass where we're trying to define something that needs to be described first. So first of all, the location is perhaps the most important thing, right? When we're talking about Haskalah, we're really dealing with a phenomenon that is Eastern European. And that is, if you want a comparative kind of contextual framework, you have to look at Eastern Europe. French thinkers and English thinkers, even German thinkers came into the Haskalah by way of Eastern Europe. They were mediated by the historical experience of Eastern European Jews, which in some ways were more complex and much less can be much less grossly described as traditional. I have colleagues who say there's no such thing as a traditional Jew, and very few of them apparently lived in Eastern Europe. That's one issue. The other issue is, and I'm a person who's very attentive to the connection between how something is said and what is said, right? The connection between form and content. And one of the most outstanding things about the Haskalah is its significance as a literary movement.
Right.
Generally, this is not, scholars of history leave literature to literature people, but in this case, you can't do it because the historical significance of the Haskalah has to be measured against its generic revolution. The great modern literary turn to a variety of new forms of writing, everything from lyric poetry to vernacular comedy. The great investment in imaginative literature, not just in Hebrew, but in the Jewish vernacular, in Yiddish, and in other languages also. German, after the turn of the half century, French, in English, this generic explosion, the availability of new forms, the revival of Hebrew. This is distinctly, whatever else we may say about the Haskalah, its ideas come to us in the form of imaginative literature. And you cannot ignore this, right? This is to appreciate the kinds of things that the masculine were able to say, you have to appreciate the necessity of new forms. The way I explain it to my undergraduates is I ask them to think about the other great literary revolution of the late antique period in Jewish history that gave us the Mishnah and the Midrash. For whatever else, and there are lots of things to say about those texts, whatever else we may say about them, the first thing we need to say is that there's an investment here in a new language and a new literary form. Without that, you can't really get anywhere, right? So that's another really important thing. Maskilic ideas about social life, Maskilic ideas about faith, about devotion, about the social order, everything that they said was mediated by their profound commitment to producing a new kind of imaginative Jewish literature that had been an object, first of all, of suspicion beforehand. And there was a trickle, right? But the explosion really doesn't come until the 19th century. So the formal revolution, the geographic revolution, and the timing, as you yourself mentioned, we're really dealing here with a post-Napoleonic kind of response to the Enlightenment that scholars of this period in other fields refer to as Romanticism. But, you don't need that word to understand that there's a difference between people who are trying to institutionalize Enlightenment principles and new political orders and people who come in once that order has been institutionalized in France and England and elsewhere, and who are pushing back against it and who are asking critical questions about the costs of modernity, what modernity means. So that nexus of developments, the geography, form, and chronology is what gives the Haskalah a new kind of historical significance.
So I'm curious about one facet you touched upon there, which is language. I think that is very significant because, of course, again, generalizing here, but a lot of the 18th century Haskalah taking place, let's say, in Western Europe or in Germany, which was really central, but much of that actually took place in German or was written in German, at least some of it, a good portion. Whereas, am I correct in saying that a very large proportion of the Haskalah going on in the 19th century was in Hebrew, was a Hebraic Haskalah? I mean, obviously that was of some importance. But firstly, am I correct in saying that was the major feature? And secondly, how important was that feature, this revivification of the Hebrew language, which people attribute to, the end of the 19th century, the Zionist movement, but actually, as a matter of fact, much earlier already in the 19th century, through the Maskilim, this was happening to a quite astonishing degree.
Well, Hebrew was huge. It's impossible to understand even Maskilic responses in other languages, right? Mendelssohn, for instance, the great sort of German language thinker, David Sorkin told us a long time ago, he wrote in Hebrew. But even if he hadn't written in Hebrew, you can't understand what he wrote in German without having a kind of Hebraic framework for some of his arguments. In the 19th century, it used to be argued quite often, both by people who liked Mendelssohn and by people who didn't like him, that for him, Jewishness and Jewish texts were a kind of sideline, that he was really a German philosopher. But if you look at his material, even some of his very German things can't really be understood outside of this Hebraic framework. All the ways in which he's an innovator in German philosophy is connected to his very specific interest in the biblical texts, his interest in literature, his understanding of Jewish law. So it's impossible to try to separate the kind of work that these people did in other languages, in Loazit, in the vernaculars, not only of the Jews, but in the local vernaculars. It's impossible to separate this from the kind of investment. When we talk about a language, we're not just talking about some kind of instrumental, it's not a computer language, right? Language has a life. Language lends itself to a certain set of conceptions. It makes grooves in your brain. So to try and separate Hebrew from everything else is very artificial. There's no way that the Tchiyah, the revival, the Jewish Renaissance of Hebrew at the turn of the century could have ever happened without the kind of work that was being done for a century and a half before that. So this divide between Maskilic Hebrew and post-Maskilic Hebrew is absurd, because you can't find it. There's no year and there's no author. The passage from Haskalah Hebrew and Zionist Hebrew is completely smooth. The line is invisible. If you're standing in 1880 or 1860, you can't see where the past ends and the Zionist future begins. It's completely smooth, this transition. And every attempt to divide it, people have tried to do this, is unconvincing, because people keep finding work that anticipates, quote unquote, Zionism and says that the Haskalah never died. So from this perspective, there is almost nothing more important. It's like Mishnaic Hebrew. How can you think about the Mishnah without Mishnaic Hebrew? You cannot think about the 19th and the 20th century without thinking about Maskilic Hebrew. It is probably the most effective and the most important and the most lasting aspect of their project.
And I suppose something which mustn't be understated, which is that, let me say how it seems to me, which is that in the Maskilic period, there hadn't been yet a really conscious effort to adapt or to modernize Hebrew, as it were, which would happen later on in Israel or with Ben Yehuda and others who would try and put the language much closer, let's say, to a modern language, a modern European language. Whereas the Maskilim, you open their books and you really feel they're writing straight out of the Beit Midrash, that they are in some way using a Hebrew which is hauntingly familiar because it really is just being completely stitched together from the classical sources that many of them would have been in contact with in the Cheder, which they all learnt in, even though some of them had fled from it and some of them hadn't. So did that make grooves in their brain, as it were, to be reading and writing in this language which they really had to excavate?
So I have to tell you that, that question of where that modern impulse really starts, right?
Mhm.
Whether it's really Ben Yehuda or it's, Vesely writing a 6-volume epic on the Exodus in this new kind of Hebrew.
Mhm.
I have to say I'm not agnostic on this issue. I have very definite views.
Please, I'd like to hear them.
I think that, first of all, the vernacularization of Hebrew that you're talking about, that started really in the early 20th century, is inconceivable without another component of Maskilic literary activity, which is completely inseparable from what they did with Hebrew, and that is Yiddish. Linguists who are looking at, Israeli Hebrew, and, some of them are kind of nuts, and there's a lot of idiosyncratic work in this area. But I think at this point, it's a completely non-controversial argument to say that much of Israeli Hebrew has Yiddish in it. And one of the ironic things about this 20th century effort to create a Hebrew vernacular that would be in use in everyday life in the new community in Israel was so heavily inflected by the Eastern European vernacular spoken by the people who learned it, not in the Best Midrash, but, their mother's knee. So that's one piece of this, right? The idea that we have a kind of transition to modern Hebrew in the 20th century that is not Maskilic basically misrepresents the complex history of linguistic evolution that, with the vernacularization of Hebrew, owes a great deal to Yiddish and is a kind of return from the attempt of the Maskilim to create a new, much more sophisticated kind of literary idiom in Hebrew. So they would say, some of my people would say, well, this is a kind of vulgarization, right? That is of the kind of language that was appropriate to the sorts of things they wanted to say. They had a great love for Yiddish, actually, but they understood the significance of something that in the 21st century we don't appreciate anymore, and that is the importance of Jewish bilingualism. We treat it as a kind of vestige of backwardness, right? And these people, they spoke Hebrew in the synagogue and the Beit Midrash, but, in everyday life, they spoke Yiddish. But bilingualism is not a sign of backwardness. It's a sign of great sophistication. The capacity of using one kind of vernacular against another more formal kind of speech to critique each other, to put them into conversation, is a sign of a sort of linguistic adaptability, this kind of imaginative movement between two worlds that most of us, unfortunately, have lost. We privilege a kind of monolingualism that was completely foreign to, the people who invented what we call modern Hebrew, because for them it worked completely together with Yiddish, which they also reinvented. So, that complicates, or at least disrupts, this very smooth trajectory from, the Maskilim did this very formal thing, came out of the Best Midrash, and then they had to learn how to be vernacular speakers. But they already knew. It's just that their vernacular was also Hebraic, in the sense that, of course, Yiddish, inseparable from Hebrew, but still separated. We don't know how to do this anymore. This kind of easy movement between one register and another. But they were past masters of this kind of thing.
Yes, and you can tell that. And the truth is, of course, that if you're living in Europe, especially Eastern Europe in the 19th century, then speaking many languages is a necessity, because you're likely to be an ethnic enclave within a much larger multilingual empire. So if you're living in Poland or Ukraine or some part of Russia, so there's the sort of the language of the street and the language of the market and the language of the court and the language of official administration. They're often quite different languages. You have to speak to Ruthenians and then Poles and who knows who else in whatever language they're speaking. And therefore, yes, this kind of flitting between different dialects would be, I assume, would be second nature to someone living in that kind of political reality. Anyway, let's go back to the Haskalah because there's much to cover on this. I was thinking, one of the claims typically made about the Enlightenment, which has been to some degree debunked in recent decades, which is that it is typically described as a secularizing force, right? And often that is written about the Jewish Haskalah as well, that it's written about within this context of, prior to the Haskalah, you had traditional society, as Jacob Katz would say, and then the Haskalah came and gave it, a massive hammer blow, which led inexorably to a kind of deterioration and secularization. And that's primarily responsible for it. And I think part of what you've done in your shifting of the Haskalah to the 19th century and to Central Eastern Europe is to gravely complicate this picture. And so, your conception of the Haskalah, to what extent can it be said to be a secularizing force, if at all? What were the relations internally and externally between these new writers and these new forms of literature with the, let's say, more traditional society from which it emanated?
Well, so first of all, the way I see my work as a historian of the Jews, I'm also, you could tell from everything I'm saying that I'm obsessed with language and obsessed with the forms and the way in which language speaks us rather than the way we speak it. And one of the things that I hope in all of my work to do is to use the Jewish experience to complicate the kinds of normative terms that all of us use without even a second thought about whether they have a kind of universal, like I said, normative application, or whether they are really specific to the language that we use to talk about the historical experience. Our historical language is English. The word secular is an English word. For a Jewish historian, it has to be a term that we question because its relevance to Jewish conceptions of things at any time, whether we're dealing with the 21st century or the 12th century, but most especially in this critical moment of transition to something else for which we don't really, all our terms are borrowed. Modernity is not a Hebrew term. It's not a Jewish term. It's a term that is imported into the scholarship from somewhere else. But secularization is, in my view, the worst offender, because it is a word that is so exclusively tied to Christian conceptions of time. It's a word that derives from the concept of the seculum, and it refers specifically to a span of time between the arrival of the Messiah and his eventual return. Obviously, for Jews, this is a non-tenable distinction. And our understanding that derives from Jewish language of what we call chol, the realm of the everyday, and kadosh, the realm of the sacred, the relationship to time and to each other, is neither contradictory nor, it's not a zero-sum game. Chol enables, in many ways, the perception of kadosh, and they always move in tandem. And there is no word, right? We use chol to translate secular, but that's not what it means. You can't translate this vocabulary into a description of what the Maskilim did, not because, it's the Maskilim did something else, but because the terms are a poor fit for the description of any aspect of Jewish experience. In this case, it's egregious because the term secularization, as you've suggested, has implications, right, for this division that Jacob Katz, God bless him, introduced into the writing of Jewish history. We still live with it. I don't want to spend my time on Jacob Katz and where he got these ideas. He got them largely from Weber and from sociology, but I want to leave that alone, right? So the question of what language can we use to describe what the Maskilim were doing?
And especially
yeah.
and especially the Maskilim of the 19th century as opposed to the late 18th century Haskalah. Is there a difference between them in this respect?
I actually think they were completely consistent.
Okay.
And the issue of personal behavior, whether it was on the part of individual Maskilim, because you're talking about two things here, right? On the one hand, you're talking about something programmatic, right? How Jews should live, right? That we call that a programmatic statement. The Maskilim actually made some, not as many as you would think. And then there's the other issue, where the Maskilim themselves, quote unquote, secular, that is, say, non-observant. So I'll take the second question first, easier to answer. No maskil that I have ever been able to find lived anything less than a completely halachic life.
Right.
And so that, I mean, before we do anything else with this, there are no quote unquote secular intellectuals in the 19th century. There are none in the 18th century. Mendelssohn was an observant Jew. And the people whose literary work was very important to the Haskalah, but who were on the margins of Jewish behavior and Jewish observance, like, for example, Heinrich Heine, another figure with whom I'm obsessed. He was a convert, right? But, even he, and this is a guy who is really, I mean, he's a convert twice over, left the Jewish fold, left the Jewish community, and still, when you look at the kinds of things that he wrote, there is a distinct maskilic perspective. So that's the other issue. Even if you can find, and Heine is virtually the only example that proves the rule, a Jewish writer from this period who writes in in German or in French or whatever, even if you can find such a guy who is what we would call completely secular, even he, in terms of his programmatic statements, never said anything. I mean, it never advocated that Jews cease their observance, that they should live as quote unquote secular people in a secular order. It never occurred to anyone, either in the 18th century or in the 19th century. Mendelssohn understood that observance, halakha, was always a decision that was a matter of conscience. This was as true in the 12th century as in the 19th and as it is today. But the idea that somehow a Jewish social movement would strike out against this kind of a millennium of halakhic observance and tell people, no, you have to be secular. You should celebrate I mean, it's unheard of. And, the question even today, I mean, yes, there are organizations that talk about Jewish secularization. I mean, I have grave suspicions about their project, but in the 19th century and in the 18th century, nicht gesteugen, nicht geflogen. There are no one is advocating secularization in the way in which we mean this term.
And it's not within the circles which we would recognize as maskilic. Anyway,
right.
Okay, so this actually, I want to maybe turn attention a little bit to a specific case study which you've touched on in your book, which was towards the end of the 18th century, which is a case study of this confrontation. Because even if they weren't advocating secularization, there is no doubt that both in the 18th and certainly in the 19th century Haskalah, there is a confrontation between the masculine or what a lot of their writing and, let's say, the traditional rabbinic establishment. And a case that you spent a bit of time on there is the case of Naftali Herz-Vesely in his pamphlet or his polemic work called Divrei Shalom Ve'emet, I believe it was 1782, and you have a slightly different reading of what is going on then. There's a furious rabbinic counter-reaction to that particular pamphlet. So could you please maybe give just a very brief overview what went on, what was going on in that affair, and how you understand it slightly differently to how it is generally presented?
So the affair, I mean, it's very easy to understand that Vesely wrote a pamphlet. The pamphlet was a response to the Toleranz patent passed by the government of Joseph II, which among its various provisions, it's not difficult to find a summary, but the real provision that mattered to Vesely was the encouragement the Toleranz patent gave Jews to enter into secular schools, or German schools, actually. The scandal was caused by sort of what to do with this law and whether Jews should adapt themselves to its provisions and send their kids to German schools. So Vesely wrote a pamphlet in which he asserted that the passing of this law initiated a new time, a new period in Jewish history. He encouraged his readers to take advantage of these opportunities. He saw its significance as epochal for Jews in the sense that they would now be able to, again, without ceasing to be observant, they would be able to combine their Torah observance, the Torah of God, with what he called, the disciplines, the learning of man, and that there should be a kind of social investment in non-Jewish formal schooling for Jewish children. And the response there were several rabbinic responses to this, but one was very vocal, and mainly it was a reaction to Vesely's characterization of the Toleranz patent as somehow different in character from any other Jewry law that had been passed before. The rabbis were the rabbi. I mean, there was no the rabbis. It was mainly Haskalah in Prague. First of all, I mean, one of the things that nobody ever talks about is the fact that in the sermon that Landau gave in response to Vesely's pamphlet, he actually said, we've been sending our kids to German schools already. I mean, we're doing this because they need to learn certain things that will enable them to function in society. What he objected to was Vesely's insistence that this was somehow a great symbolic moment, that there was some kind of shift now in the relationship between Jews and their neighbors and the government. Landau himself, I'm not so sure, was invested in a kind of ideological battle. I mean, most rabbis in this period, I think we overestimate just exactly how much social power they really had, and the extent to which they were echoing, reflecting the positions of the Jewish laity that was always far more conservative, and to what extent they were really articulating an actual kind of intellectual position. And in fact, Landau was not the only one who sounded a note of caution to Vesely's enthusiasm. Mendelssohn did it too. And in Jerusalem, he said we should be very nervous about the implications of this move. And he tempered considerably Vesely's enthusiasm for this law. So the question of how much of this is really an articulation of two distinct intellectual positions is hard to say. Every kind of controversy in which Maskilim were involved for the Jewish community about Jewish behavior and Jewish norms, the other famous one was in the 1840s in Vilna over Jewish dress. The important thing to know here is that in all of those cases, Maskilim come across as what we would call Jewish purists. They're always defending a kind of rigid halachic line against custom. And their objection to the behavior of the Balabatim, right, of the ordinary Jews, who are essentially, as far as they're concerned, basically mimicking social behavior and who don't really think very hard about what they're doing and what really is the halakha. And for them, this was a huge scandal. And, you mentioned before that most Maskilim came from Bes Medrash. They did. And part of their halachic purism, part of their kind of investment in the Kulturkampf, was against the ignorant laity. They were themselves, had an excellent halachic education, and they understood in many cases the difference in law and custom far better than the people who didn't like them. So what we're dealing with here is a kind of insistence on doing things the right way. And, people who are overeducated and who spent their lifetime learning have a tendency to be condescending and not very sensitive and not very tactful in dealing with the Jewish laity. The rabbis, whose livelihood largely depended on this laity, couldn't afford to take those kinds of intellectual risks. But many times, it was precisely the social independence of Maskilim and the fact that they made their living very often in positions other than the rabbinate. It was a crisis of authority more than anything else. It was not, you can't pin them down to a kind of, they're advocating. So they were not Reformed Jews, is what I'm trying to say. There was no, if anything, they encouraged a more greater kind of consistency in halachic observance. They didn't like the Shulchan Aruch because it was a theological book, but they venerated Jewish law and Jewish ethics. For them, it wasn't even a question that, Jews were Jews. Mendelssohn says nothing can wipe out the collective commitment of the Jews to the law.
This is correct. And this is something that those who actually start reading the primary sources of the Maskilim are often surprised. Certainly I was surprised back in the day when I started doing this and realizing this to be the case. But still, do you not admit that there is some line that can be drawn between activities of Maskilim and the processes of, let's say, the process of turning orthodoxy into reform, which or into, let's say, communities that began to assimilate and to acculturate to a greater and greater degree, that took place within Central and Eastern Europe in the 19th century. Is there some line of causation that begins with the Maskilim and ends with that? Or do you think, no, that there's a wall and they are two completely separate phenomena?
No, there's a wall.
That's fascinating.
They're completely separate phenomena. So sociologically, what we describe as secularization, or there are multiple terms for this, acculturation, the abandonment of the halachic rhythm of life, the abandonment of Jewish languages, that whole complex of things that we associate with this process. It's interesting that you brought up reform in this context, because I think if you had somebody here like Michael Meyer, he would object very strongly to the equation of this process of what we might call halachic dissolution and reform.
Right.
Because he would say that reform is a response to this lay-led social process and an attempt to actually arrest it. I mean, there are different ways to look at this thing, but one thing that we definitely know is that this is the reform project, if we can call it that, is a project largely undertaken at the initiative of the laity. The rabbis come late to this game, and I got to tell you, especially in Central Europe, and America is slightly different here, but in Central Europe, in Germany, the rabbis are always trying to put a brake on lay activity, on lay radicalism. It's very hard for them to manage this transition. And, Sorkin writes about this. Other people write about how German rabbis are always trying to kind of hold back this lay tide, the laicization that's pushing this forward. But nowhere, not in America, not in Germany, was the ideological project of reform ever either endorsed or undertaken at the initiative of any maskil. There is no overlap whatsoever. So that's the first part. None. I use Heine as my radical example because here's this guy, right, who is a convert, who writes exclusively in German, whose association with maskilic circles was very early on in his career. He hated the reform movement. He thought it was a form of Jewish Protestantism. So even somebody who is on the halachic, beyond the halachic margin, who is associated with the Haskalah is a kind of inoculation, Haskalah, the lowercase h. This kind of involvement in its activities is a form of inoculation against precisely those kinds of things for which maskilim have been blamed. Now, in terms of the lay process, Todd Endelman in the 1970s, a long time ago, told us that this process, insofar as it affects Jews, is no different from the kind of process that turned Protestantism into a kind of aspect of modernity, a form that discouraged regular church attendance, that encouraged certain forms of behavior over which religious leadership had no control, new kinds of economic activities. I mean, we're talking about a European-wide process, which Jewish intellectuals and non-Jewish ones, insofar as they were involved in it, they were always trying to stop it, to arrest it, to slow it down, to critique it. The fact that they didn't do a good job tells you how powerful this historical move was. And the enormous inducements, economic and social, of this new kind of life could not be resisted, either by Jews, by Catholics, or Protestants. So even from this perspective, it's pretty clear that the Haskalah is a romantic movement in the sense that it tries to create a framework to sort of transform people who are living under a new kind of intellectual dispensation to renew their commitment to halakha. There's a wonderful line. Giuseppe Lampedusa wrote a great novel called The Leopard. And this is a book about a romantic intellectual, an older guy who's having a lot of trouble in the 19th century coping with the changes that are overtaking Italy. And he has a nephew, his heir, this guy named Tancredi. Tancredi decides to join the Garibaldi brigades, and his uncle's very upset, right? Because it seems to him like this kind of departure from the aristocratic...
The major Italian nationalist movement.
Right, the major Italian nationalist movement. So Tancredi has to explain this to him, and he comes into his room and he says to him, and this could be the motto of the Haskalah, he says, in order for things to stay the same, everything has to change.
Right. Yes.
And that, what does that mean? I mean, you have here a group of what I would call radical conservatives. And I got to tell you, they were not the first in the history of the Jewish experience, because the rabbis were also radical conservatives who were trying to recreate a temple on paper that was no longer existing in stone. In some ways, what the Maskilim were doing, they learned this from the rabbis, the enormous power of work, working on the imagination to preserve something to which, the challenge of social and economic circumstances made increasingly difficult, and for some people nearly impossible to maintain. So what we're dealing with here is a movement that not only didn't enable the kind of process that you're talking about, but mourned it, and in many ways tried to stop it. Some of its darkest thoughts of the Maskilim were inspired by watching the consequences of this process. They were horrified by it, both in the 18th century and in the 19th century.
Yeah, this was very interesting. So Alicia actually had an interesting question. Maybe ask it, Alicia.
Sure. I was just wondering, I think that most of the conversation so far has been about demonstrating the wall between the Maskilim and the reformers. Does the wall necessarily go the other way too? Like, you could say that that's true, and also it'd be true that the laity was inspired by them. Like, they had something to do with the genesis of this idea, even if they hated it.
It's a very attenuated argument, right? With the laity inspired by them. Here's the problem. The reason for this wall is that there was almost no linguistic contact between the two sides. In other words, in order for you to make the case that the laity who put up, let's say, the Hamburg Temple, and most especially because Michael Meyer talks about it in his great book on the history of the Reform movement, most of the stuff really happens in the United States, right? So the barrier between the people who were championing this reform and Maskilic literature was very profound. In other words, they didn't have access, linguistic access or cultural access to Maskilic literature, which is essentially an Eastern European phenomenon. Even the stuff produced in Germany, right? Like the biographies of Mendelssohn, right? There was one in Hebrew, but written in the 18th century, but it was in Hebrew. So the laity who was putting up the Hamburg Temple couldn't have read it. They had to wait for the German one by Kaiserling that was published, I think, in 1869. So there is not, even, the kind of the celebration, nobody read Jerusalem.
And what about the Biur?
In Eastern Europe, the Biur was read, but there were no Reformed synagogues in Eastern Europe. In Germany itself, no member, somebody would have to carry out this research and actually look and see how many people who founded the Hamburg Temple knew anything about Mendelssohn, much less Vesely. So we're dealing here with a complete gap of sort of information. And I have to tell you, Stephen Lowenstein, who wrote a wonderful book on the history of Berlin during the Haskalah period, and that's really what it's called. It's not called like the Berlin Haskalah. It's called the history of Berlin in this period. And Lowenstein came to the conclusion that whatever was going on in Berlin high society, the kind of stuff that the Jews were doing had absolutely nothing to do with Mendelssohn at all. In other words, what we're dealing with here is a very small circle of people, most of them Eastern European, congregating around this Jewish teacher who, even Mendelssohn's closest disciples, who was known as the first Jewish Kantian, Solomon Maimon, about whom more work should be done. This is a guy who is Eastern European to the core. Yes, he wrote about Kant, he wrote about Maimonides, he wrote all kinds of things. But he wrote an autobiography in German where he basically makes the case that, no modern Jew has anything to learn from German culture or the German Enlightenment, because to be a moral person, you have to follow rabbinic law, which is much closer to Stoicism and to a rational way of behaving than the behavior of his contemporary modern German Jews, for whom he had great contempt. He created a protagonist who is kind of an indictment of this modern self-seeking. It's a book that creates an upwardly mobile protagonist who's kind of a pill and a jerk, and not anyone we would ever want to imitate. So this goes at every point. When you encounter a maskil, somebody who could legitimately, I'm telling you, Heine is my best example, because here's a guy who everybody in Germany read. Everybody. But if you read his Jewish writings, he is the most potent German critic of what he called basically Jewish Protestantism. And he did not like modern Jews. And this is Heine. Right? He's a great example of how far you can take this. When you're dealing with people, in Eastern Europe, it's true, some of them did work for the government because that's how they needed to make a living. And very often the Jewish bureaucracy needed to do certain, they had to deal with the community on behalf of the state. But nowhere was there any work that could have been read or would have been, and in America especially, they didn't have Hebrew, they barely had German. What language would they have encountered the Maskilic writing in? So we're dealing here with the biggest possible gap, and any attempt to bridge this wall, you end up hitting your own head against it, because there is no source and no piece of material where you can say, they read this and then they did that.
Interesting. Okay, we'll put that. We'll definitely put that in. Let's turn to Maskilic literature for a moment, because as you mentioned before, it was to a large degree a literary movement. So let me ask about that. What would characterize a piece of Maskilic writing? We've spoken about the Hebrew, but aside from this, what topics were they addressing? What genres were they writing in? What kind of techniques were they using in order to put forth their message? In other words, what makes the Maskilic, what you call the literary revolution, what characterizes that?
Like any literary revolution, you have to look at genres, right? The new forms of writing. We can talk about the distinction between verse and prose. Verse writing in Hebrew had pretty much been reduced to a trickle by the 17th century. The 19th century, the Maskilim gave it a new boost. They began to write Hebrew poetry. They started with epic genres, long poems on historical topics, biblical topics in many cases, but they also wrote lyric. So they were very interested in sort of human interiority, psychological verse on the one hand. And then prose genres, they covered the gamut from vernacular comedy, both in Yiddish and in Hebrew, but really, artistic prose, the short story, the novel, this is all now within the purview of the Haskalah. In terms of how would I characterize the Maskilic work, I'm sure there are exceptions to this, and I'm biting my tongue as I'm saying this, but I think perhaps the most characteristic feature of Maskilic literature is their intense interest in Jewish social life. They're interested in Jewish social life under new conditions. They're interested in social conflict. They're interested in how the individual fares against a kind of changing social environment. They're interested in all kinds of social relationships, in the new social groups that are forming, the conflict between Hasidim and their opponents, how Jewish persons handle authority. So we're dealing here with an intensely social contemporary literature that is interested in interpreting the new social reality for its reader. Most of the time, the interpretation is highly critical. In other words, this is what makes a Maskilic work. Maskilic literature takes a profoundly ironic and very often extremely dark view of the kinds of things that we typically associate with Maskilic purposes, such as higher education, such as companionate marriage, such as joining this outside world. Right? All along, with every single one of these issues with which Maskilim have been associated as supportive or endorsing, what we actually see when we hit this material is that on every issue they are suspicious, they're ambivalent, very often to the point of a very dark critique. So that's what makes the Maskilic work.
And this, to me, is fascinating, and perhaps one of the most, punchy points of your whole conceptualization of Haskalah, because this really does divide also within European history the Enlightenment from the Romantic period, because the Enlightenment literature tends to be, of course, generalizing, but a lot of it tends to be very optimistic and very forward-looking, and proposes that if we can just provide a rational scientific understanding of the world, if we can go forth and explore and discover and open up avenues of knowledge to everyone, then the world will be better and everyone will be freer and more prosperous and more healthy, etc., etc. And you have this kind of general Panglossian view of the future of humanity, whereas of course the romantic, very strong part of the romantic literature is to push back hard against that. And you have Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther and many other novels of the time basically pushing back hard against this and saying, no, actually the essential tragedy, even if you accept that openness to the world and political liberalism and what in the Christian world would be called secularization, this is desirable, but nonetheless there is inherent tragic elements that cannot be jettisoned ever. And I think you're 100% right that you read a lot of the Maskilic literature, especially the autobiographies that you mentioned, Solomon Maimon's autobiography and Moshe Leib Lilienblum and others of the time. And you're reading this and it is very dark and it is very pessimistic or extremely aware of the deep irony and inescapable tensions and difficulties of the position of the Jew who is trying to integrate into the modern world, even if that is desirable.
So, I think that's a very good way of putting it. There is no Panglossian element.
Right.
If, for the 5 seconds that Vesely tried to say, oh, this is good for us, this development, he was immediately slapped down by no less than Mendelssohn,
right.
But I think that Jerusalem was partly written to forestall and, to warn his own disciples about greeting these kinds of developments with any sense of optimism. And I have to tell you, Jerusalem is a very dark book. Very. It is a powerful critique of the social contract. It is the earliest and the most vocal Maskilic cry against emancipation, warning Jews that the love of the Gentiles, and he did this in German, mind you, because he wanted as many people as possible, as many Jewish readers as possible to read it, that this is a Trojan horse and that this gift is no gift. And position that was articulated by Salo Baron in 1928 that we still have not taken seriously. And, the idea that the modern project should be greeted by Jews with a certain amount of skepticism, and not to say pessimism, is highly characteristic of Haskalah. The reproduction of what I call emancipation anxiety was the general tenor of this literature, a tenor, incidentally, that it bequeathed to the Zionist movement. I mean, this is another place where you cannot untangle the history of the Haskalah from the future history of the Jews, and the kind of critique of Enlightenment politics, the measure of its social costs, the measure of its ethical costs, was an all-consuming public purpose of Maskilic literature. To the extent that we don't know this movement is the extent to which we do not have access somehow to this critique, and we continue to treat the hatred of Jews, its constant resurgence, right, as somehow anomalous, as somehow moving against the tenor of general progress. The Maskilim would have hated this position. To them, new forms of resistance to Jewish integration, aside from the fact of what it was costing the Jews, was a completely indissoluble part of the Enlightenment project. And to that extent, of course, they were romantics. I mean, they worried about the same kinds of questions, the erosion of ethical responsibility, sort of the disastrous kind of impact on social discipline, on the ability collectively to mobilize forces in terms of mutual aid. I mean, all of this, right? The great kind of the temptation of emancipation for them was a danger that needed extensive thinking and a kind of critical consideration that they just did not see coming from anywhere among the laity. So, and this is also the position of very often the Eastern European writer in response to the West. We have to think about Tolstoy and Dostoevsky in this kind of context. And you mentioned Goethe, but all the German romantics thought this way. So there is a kind of much richer discursive world for the Maskilim, for us to think about them. And, we need them, frankly.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And this, something you mentioned brings me to the last sort of major question that I want to touch, which is the relationship of the Haskalah to Zionism. Because again, under the sort of older form of historiography of understanding the Haskalah, so Zionism is portrayed as a solution to the failures of Haskalah, right? That this idea that there was this moment, these few decades or whatever it was, where you had this kind of optimism and this hope that Jews could peacefully and prosperously join German and French and English and Italian, etc., in Russian society, and blend in and lead good lives. And this all came crashing down, and therefore Zionism had to come and pick up the pieces and essentially propose a Jewish state and an entirely different solution than the Haskalah. Whereas, of course, under your conception, this picture is completely different. So could you perhaps explain, is there a story that can be woven in which Haskalah presages Zionism to some extent, and how would that work under your understanding of what the Haskalah is?
I mean, the simple answer to this is that Zionism is the Haskalah under another name.
Interesting.
I mean, that there is no break, that there is a completely organic tie between the activities of Maskilim and the intellectual activities of Zionism. Yes, there are certain, what I call Oedipal moves that are made by people like Smolenskin, who maybe is a Russian Jewish intellectual and himself a Maskil, who wrote this very famous diatribe against Mendelssohn, from which most Jewish history that writes, written about the death of the one and the birth of the other takes its cue. But if you read that text really closely, I mean, what you get is essentially a kind of reinvention of the Maskilic imperative in response to the German patriotic celebration of Mendelssohn as a kind of assimilationist. So what you have is not really, the Haskalah is now over. It's an attempt to basically take it on and say, well, the real Haskalah is us, right? Us Russians. We really get it. And Mendelssohn can be written out of the picture. I mean, there's a sense of, but I don't want to spend time talking about Smolenskin, but that's a kind of, anyone who knows anything about this period immediately says, well, what about Smolenskin's, rant against Mendelssohn? I mean, you got to read that thing really closely, right? Because what Smolenskin is doing is not a good argument that the Haskalah had to die in order for Zionism to be born. Actually can be read as an argument for total continuity. Now, in terms of, there are actual connections in everything that the Zionists wanted, at least initially. Zionism also has a history, and it changed over time. I think all of our signposts for these changes are probably wrong. But, and I'm actually, I should say this, I should be upfront with you about this, but I'm writing a book now about this. And
about Zionism and Haskalah?
Yes.
Good, because I was about to say, as soon as you finish your answer, I was like, Professor Litvak, the next book you need to write is Haskalah into Zionism. So I'm very glad that you have once again anticipated me. Excellent.
Well, when friends of mine read the Haskalah book, that was their question, right? I mean, what do you do now? You've written this, and so the next logical thing is to try and tackle this the relationship between Haskalah and Zionism. I'm doing that, and actually, the book I'm writing is about what I would call an axial text, written from within the Haskalah and already pointing towards Zionism. And you will not be shocked to hear, because apparently you know this text, what this text is. Lilienblum.
Right.
The book that goes by the English title Sins of Youth, which is a mistranslation. It's called Chatot Nurim in Hebrew. And of course, Lilienblum is the axial figure, right, who is both a maskil and who becomes the founder of Chovevei Zion in Russia in the 1880s. Now, one of the founders, but his life is often used as like Smolenskin, with whom he was friends, to prove that Lilienblum shows us, right? His life story shows that Haskalah died and Zionism was born. In the book that I'm writing, my argument is it shows no such thing. It shows a perfect continuity between the goals of masculine, ethical renewal, the renewal of Hebrew writing, the importance of imaginative literature to construct a kind of mental universe in which social obligation to the community could be reconceived in a new set of psychological terms, the attempt to create a devotional culture that was more true, let's say, to halachic imperatives rather than popular custom, the attempt to revivify the study house and to create a leadership for a Jewish intellectual leadership that would be fully alive to its responsibilities and to its immersion in the law. All of these goals, that we could call them social goals, that are implicit in Maskilic literature, Lilienblum brought into the Chovevei Zion movement. He's the most important Zionist you've never read, because for Russian Jews, right, in the crucial 20 years between the 1870s, let's say, and the revolution of 1905, if you wanted to read about Zionism, you read Lilienblum. So the question of what exactly happened and how Zionism became divorced from the Haskalah and what was the intellectual stake in promoting this divorce, that's a story from the 20th century. And to me, that turn and that kind of forgetting, the casting into oblivion of people like Lilienblum in favor of, Herzl, for the Russian Jews, this guy was, pretty but dumb. Nobody read Herzl. Everyone read Lilienblum, even though pictures of Herzl were everywhere. And that tells you something, right, about their respective differences. To me, the forgetting of Lilienblum and the people he represented, this crucial nexus between Haskalah and Zionism, is both an intellectual tragedy and a kind of ethical tragedy. I think we are now paying the price for forgetting this connection.
Why an ethical tragedy?
Because the evacuation of the ethical imperative in favor of the political imperative, right, is a disaster for Zionism in its future. And the way to recover it, I think, and it's not just because, I think about these issues all the time, like you, is to recover this connection to a literary movement that premised everything on Jewish ethics. Chatot Nurim, like Solomon Maimon's autobiography, is a book about a Jewish personality, right, that is the product of what we would call secularization, the temptations of the world beyond the study house, and it's a profound indictment of that personality, of what that personality looks like. It exposes to the reader the ethical implications of someone who privileges politics and its promises over ethics. And in that sense, both Maimon and Lilienblum wrote profoundly Jewish books. And not only that, but I'll say something else. Lilienblum's book owes everything to the rabbinic tradition. Generically and formally, it is a book that deploys intertextuality, which is a standard rabbinic technique of interpretation, not to redefine the biblical and rabbinic texts in light of personal experience, but to do the exact opposite, to judge personal experience and to judge personal choices from the position of the Jewish ethical tradition. And if we do not recover this pretty soon, I don't know where we're going to be.
Fair enough. I have to say, I do agree with your assessment on Lilienblum's
Oh, great.
autobiography.
One reader.
No. It's really quite an extraordinary.
Yes.
It's called Chatot Neurim, but he wrote it under this absurd pseudonym, which I can't remember, like Tzlafchad Choshim or something.
Tzlafchad Bar Choshim HaToher. And I have to tell you, I have to say this to you. You don't have to put it in the podcast.
Go on, I probably will.
But I have to say this to you, but that's not a pseudonym. Tzlafchad Bar Choshim HaToher is a literary character, like Robinson Crusoe.
Where?
What's the difference? Is that what you want to ask me?
No. Where's the literary character? I don't even know who.
I mean, you said the name was absurd, but the actual person who's represented in Chatot Neurim is not Lilienblum. He invented a literary character with this funny name because, like Robinson Crusoe, right? He had a subject.
Right.
So this is, to call it a pseudonym is actually kind of misreading of the book. The book is a novel.
But it's obviously an autobiography. I mean, it is.
No, it's not.
No,
it's not.
Okay.
It is a parody of an autobiography. And in the book that I'm writing, it's going to be called, the title of which is Anti-Biography. It reads the text like a parody of an autobiography. Of course, like every other writer, Lilienblum used some of his own experiences. But the fundamental invention of this autobiographical anti-persona is completely fictional. In other words, he created a character who was not him because he understood the temptations, the kinds of temptations that Tzlafchad experiences. But based on the way he treats him and based on the way he uses intertext, it is crystal clear that what we're dealing with here is a character.
Yeah, okay. Whatever. I don't want to belabor this point too much. No, I do agree with you, and it is clear that it's writing as if through another character. But I mean, it's hard not to read this book, and you don't know whether to laugh or cry. I mean, it's just
he's such a good writer.
It's a good writer, and it pierces you. But it's very difficult to imagine that. This is just okay. Maybe it's not fully autobiographical, but it's not an autobiography.
Okay, but this is potato, right?
Yeah, okay.
What's really at stake here is the relationship between author and character, and the relationship between author and character here is critical. Lilienblum does not identify with the person that he created. If you want to understand how it works, you should read Dostoevsky, because Dostoevsky does this all the time, where he creates characters that seem to appear in the first person. But as soon as you start to read them, you realize that the author not only does not identify with his first-person creation, but kind of hates him, right?
But it's not unusual to write a self-hating autobiography. I mean,
actually, it is unusual.
It is.
It is, this is not what the genre is for. Very often, self-hating autobiographies, they appear to be this way, but if you the classic example is Rousseau's Confessions.
Yes.
And there are plenty of places in that text where he seems to dislike himself. But if you read that book as a whole, you get the sense that he pretends to dislike himself so that the reader can like him even more. And so that the reader can forgive him and embrace him in all of his, afalpi, even though I'm a schmuck, you should still love me. This is not Lilienblum's attitude. Lilienblum's attitude is exactly the opposite. He's not looking for a kind of point of identification between the reader and his character. In that sense, what he's exercising is a kind of Jewish anti-biographical impulse. He's writing under the sign of irony. And if you were going to ask me, this question about what makes an Haskalic work, I'll tell you there's one word to describe all of them. It's irony.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I mean, it is the capacity for speaking out of what we call both sides of the mouth, right? Being able to say one thing while meaning something else.
Yes. So when you finish writing that book, we'll have you on again to discuss it. I'm fascinated by the whole thing. I can't help myself. It's so rich and interesting, as you say, intertextually head spinning. It's wonderful. The final question I'll ask is sort of a question I ask all my guests, which is something as follows: if you could choose one person let's say within the Haskalah, so someone who you've written about in your book, with whom to have dinner tonight, and you could sit down with them and ask them something, who would it be? Who do you think would make the best company? And what would you like to ask them?
So, for sure, Heine. I mean, I can't say Lilienblum because I have been with Lilienblum for the last decade, and I'm sick of him. I don't want to have any more meals with this guy. All I've had were meals with Lilienblum for the last 10 years. But, there are questions that I am dying to ask Heine, right? I mean, mostly about, he pretty much tells us what we need to know, and if he demands the most careful reader. But, this business about his various conversions and his real attitudes toward Jewish life, in many ways, he exemplifies some of the best aspects of the Haskalah, the unrelenting criticism of modernity, the profoundly literary impulse, the appreciation of what he referred to as the Jewish beard over Jewish belief, his unfinished novel, The Rabbi of Bacharach, which is one of my favorite books, and someone needs to translate that so we can finally detect its humor, which is not available to us, sadly. All of his confessional experiments. I want to know how much of it was driven by a kind of, by his poetic gifts, by his bitterness, by his rage. I mean, I can't believe that the Christianity was real. And I don't believe it. But it would be nice to have him over for dinner and just say, Harry, come on, between us, right? We both know what the story is here. The sad thing is that as a Jewish poet, he couldn't have made a living. And, the things that drove him, the absence of a robust Jewish literary culture, the complete Philistinism of the Jewish lay audience, I understand why he left. But I cannot believe it. It doesn't seem true to me from everything that he wrote. And I just want to have him over my house and just over drinks, just say to him, come on, we both know this is all bullshit. And, I already know the answer, but it would be nice to hear him say so.
The problem is, Professor, is that you're presupposing that Heine would give you a straight answer.
I know. That's right.
And this seems so unlikely because he just avoids the plague anything that isn't ironic and
he's very cagey, and that's why I love him.
Very cagey.
And and I appreciate the caginess, and in a way I'm kind of glad that I can't have him over to dinner because this just gives me more time with him. But I would also, what I would want to ask him? I would want to ask him about, what he thinks about us now. Who are we? Are we the Glauben? Are we the confessing Protestant Jews? Or are we the shofar-blowing, bearded Jews that he loved so much? Does he like us? That's what I would want to know. That's my other question. I think this he would answer. You'd probably make a joke, but since I love his jokes, I wouldn't mind.
Fair enough. Okay, unfortunately, sadly, I think we'll have to draw the curtain here, much to my chagrin. This has been a wonderful conversation. Professor Olga Litvak, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast of Jewish Ideas. And you've given us a future project that I can't wait to read and hope to have you back to discuss at some point. So we really appreciate this. Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure.
This has been the podcast of Jewish Ideas by Torah in Motion, produced by Alicia Kelman and myself, JJ Kimchi. Edited and mixed by Alicia Kelman. You can stay up to date by subscribing in your favorite podcast app. To support more thoughtful Jewish content like this, please visit torahinmotion.org/donate.